Well, you will all be happy to know that I am finally now fluent in biblical Greek. And by fluent, I mean I just finished my final for biblical Greek, and I know just enough biblical Greek to be dangerous. But realistically, this is kind of the point. The biblical Greek course that I just finished up with is designed to help future pastors like me look at different New Testament translations and evaluate them against the biblical Greek. And as a quick side note, the New Testament, if you didn't know, was written in Greek, and the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. But you may be wondering, why does a pastor that speaks English need to evaluate a text in Greek when there are so many English translations? Well, the answer to this question is actually from this same carefully constructed question. There are so many English translations. So, which one is right? Well, one of the questions from my Greek final makes this point very well. The professor says, evaluate the different ways the amount of flour in the parable from Luke 13 has been translated in the New Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, and the Good News Translation. Which translation do you think is more helpful to a modern congregation? So from Luke chapter 13, verses 20 and 21, the NRSV says, again he said, to what should I compare the kingdom of God? It is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. And now from the Good News Translation, it says, again Jesus asked, what shall I compare the kingdom of God? It is like this. A woman takes some yeast and mixes it with a bushel of flour until the whole batch of dough rises. The big difference, I hope you probably noticed, is that the NRSV tells us that it is 3 measures of flour. And the Good News Translation tells us it is a whole bushel of flour. So, which do we think is correct? Well, quite simply, both. Which is a frustrating answer, I'm sure. So, how much is a measure of flour? When you hear that in the NRSV, what do you think? Why and why does the NRSV translate it that way? Well, the Greek word here is sata, which is literally translated as measure. And here is where the NRSV and the Good News Translation are fundamentally different in their approaches to how they translate. There are 2 extremes for translation. There is on this side a word-for-word approach, and then on this side we have a thought-for-thought approach. A word-for-word approach tries to translate the words as close to the original Greek as possible, while the thought-for-thought approach, on the other hand, attempts to evaluate the meaning of the original Greek and translate that meaning into modern English. And then, of course, we have all kinds of translations across this spectrum. The NRSV is more towards the word-for-word approach, and this is the one that we read typically on Sundays. And the Good News Translation falls roughly in the middle of these 2 extremes. So which one is better? And again, a frustrating answer. It kind of depends on the verse. In this case, do you know how much a measure of flour is? Well, every time I have heard this verse over my lifetime, have assumed that a measure of flour was roughly a cup, because a cup of flour is a common measure in my lifetime. The problem, however, is that this text clearly wasn't written in my lifetime or any of our lifetimes. In Jesus' day, a measure, a sata, was between 2 and 4 gallons of flour, which means that the flour was being mixed, and it could have been up to 12 gallons of flour. 3 cups versus 12 gallons. Those are pretty big differences. For this verse, I would say the Good News Translation is more helpful to the modern reader, even though it doesn't use that directly translated word measure, which does occur in the original Greek. They assume, that being the translators of the Good News Translation, they assume that most of us modern readers won't know that a measure is 2 to 4 gallons of flour. So they modify the wording. They don't change the meaning, they just change the wording to something that the modern reader can understand. In Jesus' parable, the kingdom of God is like a yeast which a woman mixed into a whole bushel of flour. Not enough for a single loaf of bread like I always assumed, but a whole bushel of flour. That is going to bake a whole lot of bread. But just because the Good News Translation wins in this case, doesn't mean that it's going to be the best translation every time. So my solution is have a few translations available when you're reading the Bible, and if you struggle with understanding or comprehending a certain part of the text, or if you have questions when you read it, refer over to the other text and maybe it states it differently. And since you're watching this on the internet, it's a good bet that you have access to the internet. Take a look at BibleGateway.com, where you have free access to a lot of Bibles, including the Good News Translation, the NRSV, and many, many more. So, happy reading. And as for me, for some reason, I am all of a sudden really hungry for some bread.